Okay, how's it going, everyone? I'd like to send my lecture to you now about immune response against pathogens. But before we get into that, just want to cover some of the videos that you've already gone through. So, just a review of the lymph system and the anatomy that's involved. So, you guys know that the B cells are the immune cells that function primarily by producing antibodies. And we know that an antibody is any of the group of proteins that bind specifically to pathogen-associated molecules known as antigens. Basically, the molecules that tell your body what a certain pathogen is, that's an antigen. It's the chemical structure that's on the surface of the pathogen that the T or the B antigen receptors can bind to. And then if you have activated B cells, those are called plasma cells. And the next are the T cells, which do not secrete antibodies, but they perform a variety of functions that are involved in the adaptive immune response. They can either secrete soluble factors that'll communicate with other cells of the adaptive immune response to get them worked up, more T cells, or they can just destroy cells themselves that are infected with pathogens. The other is the natural killer cell, the NK cell. It's a circulating blood cell and it functions in the innate immune response. Remember, these are the cells that are not very specific, but they kill anything that is not self. Um, they're the first line of defense against viruses and certain types of cancer. And when they break down and they form pus. So that's all things that you've learned through my videos and, of course, the crash course videos. Um, then we talk about the organs. The primary lymphoid organs are the bone marrow and the thymus gland. The lymphoid organs are where the lymphocytes mature, proliferate, and are selected, and that enables them to attack pathogens without harming the cells of the body. And then the B cell undergoes nearly all of its development in the red bone marrow, whereas the immature T cell, which is called the thymocyte, will leave the bone marrow and it'll mature in the thymus gland. And then the secondary lymphoid organs and their roles, the lymphocytes will develop and mature in the primary lymphoid organs, where we just talked about. We just talked about that in the last slide, but they mount their immune responses from the secondary lymphoid organs. A naive lymphocyte is one that has left the primary organ and has entered a secondary lymphoid organ. And they're fully functional immunologically, but they have yet to encounter an antigen to respond to. So they're just not familiar with antigens yet. The secondary lymphoid organs are the lymph nodes, the spleen, the lymphoid nodules, like your tonsils, and MALT and BALT. Okay, so you should be familiar with all those so far. So let's get into this topic, which is just the entire immune response. So we talked about like very specific what cells do, but let's just talk about some more generalized responses. So the first is the mucosal immune response, and that occurs when basically mucus covers pathogens and like viruses and bacteria and does what's called neutralizing or neutralization of them. And it basically just means that this mucus has these antibodies in it that makes the pathogen unable to basically physically impossible for them to bind to receptors. Then we have defenses against bacteria and fungi. It does that through a wide variety of immunological mechanisms, and it basically is trying to find out which one is effective. And most times, bacterial infections will only become serious if you are immunocompromised. Okay, so our body is pretty good about fighting off bacteria and fungi. And if we need some help with it, we obviously have antibiotics and antifungals, which can help with that as well. The next is how we defend against parasites. And interestingly, it's thought that worm parasites that we would ingest through food is one of the reasons, or the main reason, why we have that mucosal immune response. And remember, those are the eosinophils that are attracted to the site by the T cells, the cytokines. The cytokines are the molecule that they release, which gets those eosinophils, which are the type of immune leukocyte that is good against these parasites, and that releases their granule contents and breaks down, and we sort of expel the pathogens or the parasites. And then I wanted to put this on its own slide because it's pretty important for what's going on now. But how do we fight off viruses? Well, the primary mechanism against viruses are the NK cells, the interferons, and of course the cytotoxic T cells. Antibodies are really effective against viruses, but only once you've already been exposed and you're in the protection phase. An immune individual can neutralize viruses if you've been previously exposed, right? We're all familiar with oh gosh, what is it called? Chicken pox parties, right? Where parents would want their kids to get a case of chicken pox so that they won't get it again, which I don't I don't think is the best idea, but hey. Um, Antibodies have no effect on viruses or other intracellular pathogens once they enter the cell because antibodies can't penetrate the plasma membrane of the cell. So once a virus gets into the cell, there's nothing the body can really do at that point. The cytotoxic T cell response is absolutely necessary and key because eventually that can overwhelm the virus. It'll kill the infected cells before the virus can replicate using the cell's own machinery, and so that's absolutely important. And then clonal expansion and the ability of cytotoxic T cells to be able to kill more than one target cell at a time without itself being destroyed makes these especially effective against viruses. Without those cytotoxic T cells, it's likely that humans would all die at some point from a viral infection, of course, if no vaccine were available. But that, like we've seen with what's going on in today's world, those vaccines don't come around very quickly. It takes months and months of trial and error. And so you have to hope that your body's immune response can put up with, at sometimes, a very high viral load, and that's why it's important to limit your exposure. Bacteria sometimes can evade the immune responses because they exist in multiple strains, such as different groups of Staphylococcus aureus. And some have cell walls that are even resistant to being digested by macrophages, which is pretty impressive because macrophages are very good at the jobs that they do. Now, I'd like to point out that because even though I'm talking about how pathogens can evade the immune system, I just want to point out that that's not something that they're thinking about doing. These are not living organisms, besides bacteria. But if I'm talking about a virus, these things are not thinking about doing things. They don't have that ability, but through natural selection and evolution, they have evolved the ability to evade the immune system. So that's bacteria. So some can exist in multiple strains. One example of that is MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And if you know anything about MRSA, it's a huge problem that you can actually pick up by being around other sick individuals. Or just, you can get it really anywhere, I guess. But people often get it when they're already in the hospital. And methicillin is obviously a very strong antibiotic, and if it's resistant to that, that's not a good thing. And people often can die from MRSA, if not losing limbs and things like that. So one way that we should be avoiding things like MRSA is by, if you are going to go to the doctor, make sure that you're going to the doctor for reasons in which that you are pretty much necessary. Maybe you shouldn't go to the doctor if you have a slight sniffle to be prescribed antibiotics, because every time you take antibiotics, you're basically selecting for bacteria that can be resistant to that. And what happens is we have a lot of people in this world, not just this country, but in the world, that will go and get prescribed antibiotics for maybe sometimes effects that they really wouldn't need antibiotics for, where they might just feel under the weather for a few days and their immune system could have handled it. The second thing is people who do need antibiotics might take the antibiotics, start feeling better before they've taken the full prescription of antibiotics, which is always a bad idea, because if you don't kill all of the cells, you again are selecting for the resistant bacteria. And so basically, if you do get prescribed by antibiotics, always make sure to take all of them. And then Another way that viruses can evade our immune system is through mutation. Um, Basically, viruses can change their surface molecules continuously through mutation of their DNA, or their RNA, I should say. And viruses like the flu can change enough and very quickly so that each year the flu vaccine might not work for the next strain of the flu. And so that's why you always are asked to get a flu vaccination every single season. So interestingly enough, about COVID-19, one of the good things that we have seen so far is that scientists have seen that the virus is mutating very slowly, and so that's a good thing because at least that way we can work on one vaccination that will hopefully help the entire world, and we'll just keep our fingers crossed that it doesn't mutate. Um, Another is through genetic recombination, which happens when novel viruses like the coronavirus and H1N1 will happen from the combining of gene segments from two different pathogens. And that will be an efficient form of immune evasion. Human and pig influenza viruses led to the swine flu outbreak in 2010, and we are still wondering if the coronavirus is coming from bats or from pangolins, and that happens when you keep these animals in very close, untidy quarters, like happens in some wet markets and other things like that. And so it's important to have rules and to follow the rules to make sure things like this don't happen. But unfortunately, things like this have always happened. And it's just important for us as individuals, as citizens, to do the proper precautions in a time like this, which of course includes not going out all the time. When you do, wearing personal protective equipment like masks, and just keeping yourself safe and keeping others safe. And so, not to end on too much of a downer there, but that's where I'm going to stop this lecture. So if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out via email, and I'll see you in the next one.